All right. Good morning, everyone. This is week 4 React workshop. I'm Max, and I'm going to be walking you through some React stuff, and I hope I could enlighten you on some new concepts. So let's get started. Um, Basically, we're going to start out with what is React, because React itself kind of sounds like a verb, and you know that doesn't really sound like coding to me. Basically, React is a framework of JavaScript that allows us to build interactive user interfaces. Um, it basically makes it a lot easier for building front ends for websites or any other user interfaces, so that we don't need to have all these separate files, like one for HTML, one for JavaScript, and one for CSS. It kind of combines it all into one framework and incorporates some coding logic to make it easier for us as developers to build front end and clean UIs. So one thing you might be asking yourself is, why use React when we already understand or know about HTML, CSS, or JavaScript? Well, React isn't really that much different. It's an extension of JavaScript itself. So we're not really learning anything totally new. But one thing that React does that makes our lives easier is it uses this concept of declarative code, which describes the end result of what our product would be, rather than a step-by-step guide of how to do it. One downside of declarative code, as we'll see, is that it is error prone in the sense that there's no typing. So if you're familiar with Java, you'll know typing way too well, how whenever you define a variable or a data type, you always have to give a type to it. Whenever you define a method in Java, you'll always have to give a return type if you specify it, or but yeah, basically Java kind of requires you to type your stuff, which makes it easier for you to catch bugs. However, with just using JavaScript, JavaScript doesn't require us to type our variables, which can be good where we don't really need typing that much. And we just want to kind of create our code to get the job done. But the place where this kind of becomes bad is when we're working on group projects and big collaboration projects, such as, for example, a website. Not having typing, you kind of lose a grip on kind of I would say I'm kind of losing the word, but you kind of get what I'm saying. Typing allows us to kind of have a concrete idea of and non-manipulation of our code. So let's kind of look. Let's look what a React file will kind of look like. So here is an example of a React file. Let's call this React file luckynum.tsx. And if you're wondering what .tsx is instead of .js is, TSX stands for a TypeScript file extension rather than a JavaScript file extension. But for now, we can kind of just think of this file, or this React file, as a JavaScript file. So at the top, all of our React files always have to import React first. So we can see that, right here. And then all of the files that we have in React use, as we learned in JavaScript last week, what are called anonymous functions, or Lambda functions, but I think we're going to use the terminology anonymous functions. They kind of use anonymous functions to return JSX. So we'll talk about what JSX is in one moment, but let's kind of break down what this React, um, I would use the terminology component, which we're going to use in a second. But let's kind of break down what the React file is saying. So we have this an anonymous function named LuckyNum. And in this LuckyNum function, the purpose of it is we're going to display our lucky number to the user in our user interface. So we're going to define this this variable right here, my lucky num. We're going to say our lucky number is 7, just for this example. And what we're going to end up doing is display our lucky number in an h1 tag. So as we learn with HTML, an h1 tag is just a header tag. So all this is going to look like on a website is just my lucky num is, and then lucky num. This kind of syntax right here, what you're seeing with the curly braces, is how we use variables in our return of JSX, which we'll explain in one moment. But I just kind of wanted to show, I guess, what a React file would be like before we dive into it. So this file is an example of a component, and as I was saying, what we're doing right here with our return statement is we're returning this thing called JSX, and JSX is just a fancy term for HTML and JavaScript. So as you can see, we're kind of recognizing maybe familiar topics such as a div or an h1 tag. This is basically just HTML. However, we call it JSX because some people wanted to name it that, and we're just going to stick with it because some stuff. Each component, this is important that each component, when we're returning JSX, must be contained in a wrapper. A wrapper is just kind of I guess a containment for our code. In this example, our containment wrapper is just a div tag. So normally with our JSX, we're going to be wrapping our I guess we're going to be wrapping our JSX with a div tag just because it's the easiest and most default. So moving on, components. Basically, what we just saw here is an example of a React component. The component name here would be lucky num, and basically what the component's purpose is to display our lucky number using our components. So basically, we can think of this figurative person named John, and John wants to display his lucky number to all of his friends. So John goes and ends up building a component to display his lucky number using this syntax. Before I move on, is there any questions or clarifications that I can make for anyone? I'm gonna take the silence as I'm doing an okay job, so we're gonna move on. Also, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, because I know this can be a little confusing. And also, oh, we do have a question. Is there any basic boilerplate for React? I'm kind of confused on what the question is. If it's kind of, is there any, I guess, default like layout for a React file? Is that what you're asking? Yes. So this would kind of be it. All React files have we always have to import React from React. So that would be definitely one thing you'll see in a React file. Another React file is that each file, we usually use the convention that each file contains a component, and the component is just the anonymous function. So the component right here would just be the anonymous function lucky num, and this is in a React file, you'll always have the import statement for React, and you always have the component right here, the anonymous function. And something that we're just going to say you have to do right now is you're always going to have to export default the component. So this, I guess, file right here is kind of the I guess what you're saying boilerplate template for what a React file could be. Obviously, we can get into a lot more complicated and more complicated things in React, but I would say this is the basic. I hope that answers your question. Cool, nice. Let's move on. So, like I was just saying, John just created his component. He's so happy. He gets to display his lucky num. However, he has this other component he made. And remember, a component is just an anonymous function in a React file. So he has this other file over here that he wants to display his lucky num with. The other file is called a profile component. And in this profile component, we're going to take a look at it 1 second. John's going to display his name, his favorite color, and his lucky number. So let's take a second to look at what that would look like. So as we can see, we have John's profile pic, which is just this profile image.jpg. We're not going to worry about that because that's somewhere in our directory. We have his name right here, John. His favorite color is blue, and he wants to display his lucky number. So he could just write a header tag or h1 tag to just say my lucky number is 7. However, John already wrote a component called lucky num. So what we can actually do is import the lucky num component we just wrote and display it in the profile component. So if you didn't already recognize, we're in another file right now. I know it's a little difficult because we're not in IDE, but just bear with me. This is another file. We're going to say that this file is named profile.tsx. And so we can see that this is a React file, by identifying that it imports React and it's exporting an anonymous function right here. One thing that's different between this component and our last component is these braces. So as you can see, we're using parens instead of curly braces here. And this is just a convention that I actually found out about from someone in C4C, how if you're just returning JSX. So here in our anonymous function, we're defining a variable here. So we're not just returning JSX, we're also defining a variable here. However, in our profile component, all we're doing is just returning JSX. And again, JSX is just HTML. So all we're doing is returning HTML. In this case, we don't need to define a return. We don't need to state that we're returning JSX. All we can do is just wrap the JSX in parens instead, and React will know what you mean. So it's kind of, I would say, convention to do it this way. But the thing we're interested in is how does displaying a component inside another component works. And so basically all we need to do is import our component from the destination. So we're just going to say in our directory. So we imported this lucky num component, and now we're going to use it by defining lucky num, the name of the component, in a self-enclosing tag. So we were able to use the component we just made by importing it. And once we import the component, we can display it in a self-containing tag like so. And this will basically go into this component and grab this JSX and kind of replace it here. So now we're displaying this in here, but we didn't actually need to rewrite it. And so you can kind of guess why this is convenient for us as developers, because we want to try, our goal is to kind of write as little code as possible and kind of reuse as much code as we can. And, obviously have that code be open to extension, but closed to modification. And so importing this component allows us to use this code in multiple places. One, two, we don't have to rewrite this component everywhere we want to use it. And so this kind of makes it reusable in a sense, and very, I guess, it just makes it easier for us to use as developers. So before we move on to props, is there any questions so far on what we just did? I hope I explained it semi-well, that you can kind of get an understanding. If there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Again, if you want me to go back to anything, just let me know. I'd be more than happy to, but we're going to move on. So, props. Congratulations, we now just know how to make a component in React, and we know how to make a React file. So you did it, you know how to do React. Now we're going to learn some other fun things we can do in React that will make our code a lot more reusable and a lot more reliable. So we need to kind of understand what props are before we start to use them. So let's say that we want to create a function that prints a message. And let's say that we wanted to first print a message hi. So how would we do that in JavaScript? I would normally ask you, but I kind of displayed it already. Does someone want to answer that, although it may be very trivial? Yeah, you guys are right. So in order to print hi, all you'd have to do is you'd create a function called print hi. And in print hi, we would just console.log hi. And for any of you that don't know what console.log is, it's kind of the equivalent to system.out.print in Java, and basically prints whatever string you give it to the console, which is, the terminal or whatever the system is in what you're using it with. So if we wanted to print a message and we wanted to print hi, we would make a function for print hi. However, I want to print another message now, and I want to, instead of saying hi, I want to say hey. So I can't use print hi because I know print hi only prints the words hi. And so if I wanted to say hey, I would have to create another function in JavaScript that says hey. And so in this print hey, we're going to say console.log hey. So this does get the job done, right? If we only wanted to print hi and hey, but let's say I wanted to print any message I wanted to. We would kind of need to create a function for every conceivable message that we wanted to use. And so that doesn't really seem first that possible. And one, it doesn't really seem that helpful to us. So one thing we learned about in JavaScript is that we can pass in arguments to our functions, and we can use those arguments in the function. So an example of how to make this, I guess, print message like type thing that we're trying to do reusable and easier to use is by taking in a message as an argument and then console.logging that message to the console. And so in this sense, we can use this print message function anywhere we want to print a message. So this would be the same as we can say hi, we can just pass in hi to this function, or we can pass in hey, or we can pass in anything we wanted to. the key thing is that we now made our function reusable, and yeah, that's a lot of it. We made it reusable, and we can now use it in many different circumstances. Are there any questions on how, are there any questions on this? I know this is kind of a little review from last week, but it's kind of essential for what we're going to dive into next. So if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and say that you guys are so smart that you already get it. I think that's the case. So we're going to move on. So using props. So basically, props work the same way as what we're doing here. Props kind of are, we'll see in 1 second, as we revisit the lucky num component again from what we just made in the first part of this workshop. If we see in our lucky num component, we're doing the same thing as what we did in the function print high. This lucky num component can only display the lucky num 7. So if I wanted to display the lucky num 11, does anyone know how I would do that? Just using this context right here. So if I wanted to display my lucky num is 11, how would I have to do that? Yeah, you guys are right. We would have to make another component, and we would have to change the variable my lucky num to whatever I said. I think I said 11. So if we change this to 11, then that component would display my lucky number is 11. So basically, we're doing the same thing that we were doing here, where this print high is only printing high. This lucky num component is only printing 7. And if we wanted to change, remember, print high to hey, we would have to change 7 to 11. So let's go back to our example, and we can kind of use the same approach by taking in an argument to make our lucky num component more reusable. So what we're going to do is take in argument in our anonymous function called props. And what we're going to do with the props, well, this is kind of a little messed up, but basically what we can do with the props is, well, first, the argument props itself is a JavaScript object. I think we learned about this last week, but basically an object is, you can kind of think about is this, data structure that houses different pieces of data. So in props, what we can expect to have is a field called lucky number, or my lucky number, and what we can use, and we can use that field to display our lucky number. So there may be an error in our slides, but what we would do here is we would use there's a kind of error here, but basically, since props is an object in JavaScript, what we can do is use our dot accessor, where we could say props dot my lucky number. So we're going to say in the props object that we're getting passed in, because that's all that props is just an object. In this object, let's grab the field my lucky number, and we can display that. So that's kind of how props work in React components. Are there any questions? I know there's a little error in our slide, so kind of bear with me. But yeah, you kind of get the concept that props, you get the problem that props is trying to solve for us. It's kind of trying to solve this reusability problem we have. So if there are no questions, I'm gonna go ahead and say you guys get it and you're doing great. So next question is, okay, yes, we will. Connor just said something that we will do in 1 second. Um, so next what we're wondering is we're using our lucky num component, right? Again, if we go back here, we're using our lucky num component in our in this component profile, which John is displaying his profile characteristics such as his name and his color and his lucky number. So how would we, now that we introduced props to this lucky num component, how would we, I guess, pass in a prop or pass in, an argument in this sense? How would we pass in an argument to our lucky num component? So as we see right here, we're back in our profile component, and the only thing that's changed is, well, there's kind of a storyline here, so I should go ahead and explain that. John's friend Doug, okay, he's going to create his own profile right here, and he wants to use the lucky num component. And so he wants to, and we just made the lucky num component reusable. So now that he can pass in his own lucky number. So in this profile, this is Doug's profile. His favorite color is purple, and his lucky number here is 11, as 1111. It's a lot of ones. Basically here, the only difference we have between this profile component and the other profile component is this kind of statement right here, where we say lucky num equals this number. And so all that's doing is saying our, basically, it's allowing us to pass in the argument lucky num to our props object here. You can kind of think about this, you can define multiple fields for your prop, but you can kind of think about it as lucky num is going to be the field in the propped object. So that way we can say props dot lucky num here, and that would display our lucky number. So now that we've established that lucky num would be the field in the props object, the value of lucky num would be what we set it equal to. So since we set lucky num equal to 1111, we're going to now have a field in our props object back in here named lucky num that has a value of 1111. And so if we want, and then so basically behind the scenes in React will basically, if we said here, because this is a typo, let's just say we said lucky num dot or props dot lucky num. And here that would display what the value of lucky num is in our props object. And as we said here, that value would be 1111. Is there any questions up until now? No? All right, cool. I'm glad that this is coming easier than I thought it would be. You guys are real smart, all right? Here's an exercise that we can do. How do we make our profile.tsx component, which is this, more reusable with props? In other words, how can we use the file profile.tsx with anyone's information? So as you can see here, we have, this is a profile specific to Doug. And in our last profile component, this was specific to John and John's color. So using props, as we just learned, kind of a exercise, how can we use props in our profile component to make it more reusable. I know this is a lot. If someone's feeling up to it, you can unmute yourself and tell us. If not, we'll give you like a minute to kind of think it through, and then we'll go over the answer. Yeah, you guys are both right. Yeah, we would make props an object and have the fields name and color. In addition, yeah, basically what you just said. So let's go ahead and look what that would be like. An extra thing is you can also have this profile URL, but yeah, you were right, props.name. So we're actually having this object props, and we added the same thing what you guys said, a name and a favorite color along with the lucky num here. So in a sense, now this profile component is reusable. So now John and Doug can both use the profile component. Any of their friends can use the profile component to display their name, favorite color, and lucky number along with their profile URL. Yeah, good job. Is there any questions about how this is possible? Seems like you guys get it, but I'll wait for 1 second. So I forget what this is called. Connor said this is called something with string, but this is basically, yeah, it's called string interpolation. And it basically, so in our source, you see how we have a string profile image dot JPEG. This basically, this $ allows us to use to basically make whatever profile URL is, which is going to be a string. It basically allows us to put that into what the source string would be. It's kind of the convention we use for that, if that makes sense. The $ basically just yeah, the $ just basically says we're going to use this variable here for the string instead of you know, just the string itself, props.profile URL, because we want to use the variable, not the string itself. So I hope that makes sense. Cool. If there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and move on because you guys seem to be getting it. I'm happy that you are.
Excuse me? Hello?
I'm sorry. Hi.
Hi. Like, I just kind of got lost at that last part, like when you said variable instead of the string. Like, isn't the string and the variable the same?
Yeah, so this isn't really that important to React in general. This is kind of just like a, I guess, something we would use in like a JavaScript type of way, but I'll go ahead and explain it. So just don't, I guess, stress if you're not getting it. But basically, if we didn't include this $, these, I forget what these are called, but basically these are another form of what can house a string. So we can house a string in double quotes, we can house it in single quotes, but we can also house it in these things. I'm going to call them backticks or grave marks. Nice. Thank you, Connor. So if we didn't include this $, basically what source would be equal to is curly brace props.profile URL curly brace. Just that string, like this, just like literally that. What the $ allows us to do is say, we don't want the literal string to be props.profile URL. We want it to be whatever the value that's in props, that's in the field profile URL. Profile, sorry. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of hard because I can't really draw anything out. but kind of think about it as so we have this string React here, right?
Yeah.
So let's just say we replaced React with just props.profile URL with the curly braces. And it would just be a string, right?
Yeah.
So if we were to print out that string, it would literally be, in the sense, curly brace props.profile URL, right?
So the $ makes it refer to like the value of props.profile.url.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. No problem. Glad I could help. Any other questions before we move on? That was a good question, by the way. Nice. And I guess Nick also asked it, so good job, both of you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to state management. So what John is now going to do with his component, we're just going to go back to the profile component we didn't use with props just to make this easier. So John wants to now add a button of number of likes. Basically what this likes button is going to do is going to be able to with the click of the button, we're going to be able to like a profile. So how do we do this in React? It's kind of a question that may arise. So first of all, what is managing state? You can kind of think of state as the data that persists through each clock render, although it's kind of, that's not really how React works. React kind of displays data and then renders it on whenever the data changes. I'm pretty sure, right, Liam?
Yep.
Yep. So whenever data changes in our React component, React will re-render the component. Basically, what we can do with managing state is it allows us to kind of keep track of variables that I guess we would otherwise. Let me put it this way. Managing state is kind of like defining variables for a React component and allowing us to mutate them in a sense. I'm going to go ahead and explain it more in depth, but what we do when we manage state is we use this React hook called useState. And in order to use this hook called useState, what we first have to do is import it with React. And so the way we do that is by having these curly braces for it. And that's because it's a named export, which we'll learn what a named export is versus a default export in the future lecture. But basically, this is how we import useState to be used in our profile component. And basically, we can kind of implement it like so. So in order to use useState, we kind of make a constant array that has both the state itself and then a setter function here. So what this is a correct usage of useState. So we can kind of think back to our message example with the JavaScript, how we want to keep track of a message to display. So what we can kind of think about here is that the message in this useState array, kind of, in this array is the message we're going to be keeping track of. It's the data. And then we have this function right here. It's a setter function called setMessage, which we can use it like so by passing in another message. And what basically this will do is change message to whatever you pass in to the setter function. One thing we should also cover here is that whatever value we pass into useState, when we are defining, I guess, when we're defining like a data type that we want to use with useState, whatever we're passing in here is what message is going to be initialized to. So right here, we're passing in hello world, and hello world is going to be, or message is now going to be initialized to hello world. And so rather than trying to describe this abstractly, let's go ahead and look at it on how we would implement this in our profile. Well, I guess a better exercise would be how do we implement this, but I kind of did a semi job of explaining it, and I feel like this will allow you to get a better understanding of what useState does. So again, in order to use useState, we have to import it at the top of our file. And now we can kind of define this const array, which has the first thing is our data, which we want to hold, which would be profile likes. And the second thing is our function that allows us to set profile likes. And we usually just use the convention that we say set and then whatever our data was named. So we do set. So since our data was named profile likes, we say that it's going to be set profile likes. And here we're saying an equal to useState. That's just the syntax that we do. And then we're initializing profile likes to 0. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. And now we can display the profile likes by just displaying this data right here. And so what we've done is basically made a way to, I guess, keep track of our data and make it easily mutatable. If that makes sense. Basically, if we wanted to now have our button, if we wanted to have a button that whenever we clicked it, we increment the likes of profile, this is how we would kind of do it. So we have first our data, right, is profile likes, and we have our setter function. This is all the same, and this is the same as before. We were displaying the profile likes. The only difference is we're adding this on click. I don't think we need these braces here. That might be a typo, but the only difference is we're adding this on click handler that basically says whenever this button is clicked, we're going to basically set profile likes to whatever profile likes is +1. Does that make sense to everyone? And so in a sense, now we're mutating our profile likes and we're being able to use that in our component. Any questions on how we just did that with useState? I hope it's straightforward. We're kind of running low on time, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Typescript, what we kind of discussed at the beginning, what the kind of downside to JavaScript is that we don't get this typing. We can call we don't get to type our variables and we don't get to type our data. When we have a bunch of contributors on our project, it's important that we use types so that everyone knows, or to kind of prevent as much errors as possible, so everyone knows what variable this is, and we don't call a function that expects a different type of variable. And so basically it allows us to not break our code. I'm going to be saying like typing, and basically what I say by typing, I mean it's like the act of giving our code types. Yeah. How to type in React. What we have here in, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly since we only have 10 minutes left. We have our useState. We have our useState hook right here, what we just used for profile likes. In order to type this, all we would do is say that useState is a number, because profile likes is going to be a number, correct? So all we have to do here is type our useState as a number. Likewise, in message, when we first created that example useState, we said that message was going to be the string hello world, and so we would type that like so. Let's go ahead and type, I guess, a React file. So if we wanted to go back and type our lucky num file, there's a couple things to break down, which I'm going to go through relatively quickly. So just stay with me. First thing first is that we're going to now type the anonymous function as React functional component, and it's going to have the type of lucky num props. So since we're taking in props, what we like to do is know what those prop types are. And so in order to do that, Typescript allows us to define an interface where we can define the types of the props and their respectable name and their type. What I mean by that is we allow what this interface is allowing us to do is say what field names we're expecting and the types of those field names. And we add this read only kind of keyword to say that we're only going to be reading these props and displaying them. Does that make sense? So basically, this lucky num prop thing here is basically we're saying that lucky num is taking in basically the props, and we're expecting the props to be what this interface defines them to be. Yeah, that's kind of the basics of typing. You can kind of delve into typing or dive into typing a lot more if you go to Typescript docs, and you can kind of check that out. We're kind of running low on time, so I'll go ahead and that's where you can find that out. Material UI. So Material UI is this component library that makes styling our components a lot easier. So do you remember, so remember last week when we had to write CSS for each of our HTML files and kind of style them with, yeah, we had to style each separate one, and we kind of had to make sure that each of our HTML files are styled in the way we want it to display to the screen. They would have to have like flexbox and all this like stuff that makes it easier for resizing, and that's a pain in the ass because it takes so much time and we hate it, so we don't want to use that. What we're going to do is we're going to use Material UI. Basically, Material UI just has a bunch of components that are pre-styled, which is super helpful because we don't need to spend a bunch of time messing with flexboxes and grid layouts. We basically have all of these things given to us. So I think I'm gonna touch on one Material UI component because we're running low on time. But basically the component I want to touch on is the button because it's the simplest. If you go to materialui.com or wherever I said that you can find that, it's like in the docs that we have. But if you go to their website, you can find a list of all the components they have, and they're all super useful because they all come pre-styled and they can be like decked out to make your application look sick. Basically how we use a button is we import the component name, which is button, from Material UI core, which is just the place where we can find the component. And the way we do this is just by naming the button tag. We just open a tag with the name of the component we want to use, and since the component name is button, it's just going to have button. And basically what this allows us to do, it's going to be, if you look on Material UI's website, it's just going to look like a way prettier button, and it's going to look pretty cool. And so that's all you would do to use Material UI components. One other thing is styling Material UI components. And what we do to use this is we have to import something called make styles. And rather than explaining it, let's just take a look at it. What we have to do is import this component called make styles. And basically what make styles allows us to do is define a bunch of objects that have CSS rules. Basically, we could add a lot more CSS, I guess, rules to our use styles, which is kind of what we're naming our styling convention. I wish I could delve into this a lot more, but we're running really low on time. So basically how we would use this in our React React component is by first defining a constant that we name classes, and it's going to be equal to this use styles function we named up here. And the use styles is going to be equal to the function make styles, which is what we defined right up here. And basically what make styles takes in is one big object that has a bunch of other objects as its field. Each object is a rule. So one object in that big object that we're passing in to make styles is called make button black. And so all it's going to do is make the font of that button that we defined back here 30 pixels, and the color is going to be black. And now wherever we want to use our newly styled rule, all we'd have to do is in the button component that we defined back here, we just have to make our class name be equal to the classes, which is this make styles, right? We said make styles is one big object, and we would have to use the dot accessor to access this object or this rule. And that would basically allow our button to be the color black and be 30 pixels in font size. So that was a lot of information. I have a headache just from explaining it. I'm sure you have a headache just from learning it. These are some helpful sources that could aid you in your quest for learning React and all the things we described today. In addition, Sadaf just posted in the chat a link to the doc site where you can find a detailed description of what I just said with better vocabulary and better grammar. But yeah, that was a lot of information. You guys did great. If there are any final questions you guys have, if not, that's it for me. I hope I did a decent job in explaining React.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Thought it was great, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Liam.
Of course, of course. Thank you guys all for coming. As always, we're going to be posting a care package with all the materials and then the code that you can work on this week. We know it's midterms, so if you're busy and you can't get to the assignment, don't worry about it. But we want to make sure those are available to you. So that'll be going out later today. And thank you all for coming. And I think we have a feedback link. If you guys have a minute,
we have a
you
feedback
want to feed that
link.
back. There you go. Either use the QR code or the bit.ly link. All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye. It was nice meeting you.